Shall we?
Yeah.
We shall. All right. Welcome, everybody, and thanks to the folks that are joining online. So I figured I'd do a technical hiring workshop, which is basically just all of my learnings that I've learned from hiring the tech team at CoachUp. And Megan, are you going to be driving the presentation? Okay, yeah, you can hit the next slide. So really quickly, these are the things I want to go over today. We're going to talk a little bit about team structure, sourcing candidates, the hiring process in general, how to assess candidates' abilities, how to win candidates, and then we'll go into some interview tips, techniques, and examples. I'll also send this deck out to everybody if you need it. So don't have to write everything down. We'll go through it. Cool. You can hit the next one. All right. So everything with tech hiring typically revolves around team structure. So when you're talking about figuring out who you need to hire, it really starts with the product itself that you're trying to build, and then you want to back out of that. So next slide. What I always like to say is, this is a really good example. It's like, think of two sites like TripAdvisor and Airbnb, two products that essentially kind of do the same thing, but if you look at the actual product, it's very, very different. So, and actually the difference comes from the team structure itself. So if you look at, TripAdvisor, there's like 1,000 things to do. I have no idea, like, particularly where to start or what to do. Whereas Airbnb, if I look at this site, it almost looks like artwork, right? You can take this and kind of hang it on your wall and it looks beautiful. And there's literally one thing to do. And if you notice, if you dive in deep, this actually stems from the team structure at both places. Hit the next slide. So from looking at the team structure at TripAdvisor, basically everybody is kind of a full stack dev. They work up and down the stack. They do everything from designing to back-end devs, to visuals, to front end, and it shows in the end product. Airbnb, on the other hand, they're kind of made up in these little pods where you have a UI, UX designer, front-end dev, back-end dev, and they actually have a data scientist to throw some data on. Hey, man, how's it going? Good. So, the idea of who should I hire, what kind of team structure I need, really starts with your product, and then you kind of back out of things from there. Okay, so identify your biggest need. How is by matching your hiring process with the stage that you're in. So I kind of break down the stages here. There are some caveats, but for the most part, what you want to do is think about what stage you're in and who you're going to need for the foreseeable future. When you're an early stage company, really what you want to do is get somebody in who's going to be super effective right now. You're not hiring for, years down the line when you need, God bless you, when you need like things done absolutely right now. So early stage, hire people for the next 6 months, people that can fill the position now. If you need them to grow, maybe they will, but if you don't get the job done now, you're never going to get to the adolescence, growth stage, et cetera. The adolescent stage, basically what you're doing is you're hiring for the next year. So you're bringing on people that can do the job now, but you really want them to grow at the business for the next year or so. And then when you get to the growth stage, that's when you want to start having these larger conversations and you're kind of, bringing people in with experience who've like been there, done that before, and you're really looking for someone that can kind of up your level and kind of take you to the next level. But it's important to think about what stage your company is in when you are putting together your hiring process. And this is kind of how I broke it down. That's not to say that there's other ways to do it, but this is just a general framework of how to think about the types of people that you want to go after. Cool. And then, of course, the caveat, there's always caveats, is be open to star players that come on the market, even if it's not your biggest need necessarily right now. And I always like to say it's car buying versus home buying. So a lot of times, especially in the engineering world, it's more akin to buying a house than buying a car, right? The car, you can say, all right, I want a Toyota Corolla in red, like a 2012 model, right? You can get very granular of exactly what you want. But with some of the folks who are more experienced, it's more like buying a house where it's like, it's on the market right now. This is what you can get. You don't really have a lot of choice. Like, yeah, I get you would want a lot of choice to kind of specifically say who you want, but this is what you have to do. So I always like to kind of throw that analogy in there. Okay. All right. So the actual process itself, the best advice that I have is to, one, define a hiring process, systemize it, and then use it to determine candidates' abilities in a systemized way. One of the biggest things that you can do in general to differentiate yourself from other companies is to actually have a process. Just the appearance of being professional and having a standardized process that you put everybody through will actually set you apart from everyone. I can't tell you how many interviews I personally have gone on where it just seems like it's all over the place and it seems like you show up and they're kind of making things up as they go. So just by having a process that you can tell people what it is and exactly what to do and what to expect will actually set you apart from other companies. And it's actually something that's very easy to do. So kind of like at a baseline, you should do it. And we'll go into what it is to kind of an example of one as well. The other thing to remember is that typically it's a democratic process, but don't confuse it for a democracy. Especially as your team starts to grow, you definitely want to get feedback from your entire team on all the hires that you're going to make. But at the end of the day, really, it comes down to you. Like you're the person running your business, or it's your job to build or run this team. So while you want to incorporate feedback from everybody, your team eventually is going to grow to the point where you may not have unanimous buy-in for every single candidate that you have. So it's important to understand that you still want it to be a democratic process, but that doesn't mean it's a democracy and that one person can veto it and say that's it. That's important to mention because if you do get to that point where you need unanimous buy-in from your whole team, it can very often stall the hiring process in general. And you need to kind of keep things moving along, especially if your company's building and growing. And then the other 2 points, speed is everything when it comes to tech hiring. The faster you can move on a candidate, the better success you have. But you also want to be mindful and protect your team's time and not kind of waste it on candidates that aren't a good fit. Boom. Okay. So let's start with job descriptions. And I think I sent this deck out to a couple of folks, but one of the biggest pieces of advice I have is to cast a wide net with job descriptions. What do I mean by that? So for every job position that you have, people think of themselves differently. So this is a great example of, if let's say you're hiring somebody to come in and be the lead engineer, like a lead dev to build your product, right? You don't necessarily care exactly what the title that person has. What you need is your product built, and you need it built in a timely manner. So whether that person comes in and is a senior software engineer, a lead software engineer, or VP of engineering, doesn't really matter too much to you. What you actually need is the product built. So one of my biggest recommendations is to, for every position you have, create several different job descriptions with different titles. Because people think of themselves differently. Somebody who is a senior software engineer currently somewhere might look at a job description for a VP of engineering and say, that's not for me. Like, I'm not really ready to be a VP of engineering, but I could totally be a lead software engineer, and vice versa. Like someone who's like a team lead somewhere can be like, all right, well, I want to, take the next step in my career, and I'm not interested in another lead software engineering position, but I'm interested in this VP of engineering role. So just casting a wide net in general gives you that kind of top of funnel volume that you're going to need to really get a process up and running and get the best candidates. Okay, so the process that I've typically used, and by the way, take this with a grain of salt and you can kind of make it your own, but the one I normally use is go back and forth via email, kind of create some email rapport, have a phone screen or Zoom chat with the person, have an in-person interview, which of course could also be just kind of a larger group interview if you're doing this remotely via Zoom, and then move to make a decision or make an offer as quickly as you possibly can and get it in people's hands. So that's the process I typically use.
Arian,
yeah.
What's your thoughts on like a technical challenge going in there to test some of it?
100%. And we're going to go into that in a little bit and go through it. So talent sourcing. So you want to hire like a pirate. I really just wanted to put a picture of a pirate in this presentation. So I achieved my goal. But basically what I'm trying to say here is, a lot of folks here, like they're familiar with a sales process. And so hiring is a typical sales process where you want to set up a typical sales funnel. So it's not that dissimilar. So you still talk about acquisition, activation, retention, and referral. So all of those same kind of sales tactics apply to putting up a funnel for hiring. Cool. All right. So on the acquisition side, the biggest piece of advice I have is there's no shortcuts when it comes to hiring. You literally just have to put the effort in. And the reason is because the people who you are most likely going to go after and want to hire probably already have jobs, right? The folks that are just kind of floating about without jobs, there's probably a reason. So there's no shortcut to hiring. You have to put in time to actually find quality people and proactively go after them and sell them. And there's just no shortcut to that. Yeah. So in terms of acquisition tips, these are things that I have typically used, and the process that I typically use revolves around really spending a lot of time on LinkedIn, especially to start filling up top of funnel, looking at folks' GitHub to kind of create a rapport and like tell them things that you like that you see that they have worked on in the past. Reaching out, a lot of folks, especially developers, are very active on Twitter and other social networks, so don't be afraid to reach out, interact with them there. And then the biggest one that a lot of people don't even think about is using their own engineers. But some of the best hires I've ever made literally came by talking to the existing engineering team and saying, hey, in the past like couple years, who are the best engineers you've ever worked with? What are their names and where do they work now? Like, can you make an intro? So a lot of people underestimate the power of their own network to actually mine for leads, and that's where you actually get the best take rates, because you can get a warm introduction to them. Cool. All right. So in terms of acquisition, if we're talking about standing out from the crowd, there's a couple of things that you can do. So one, co-founder, CEO, CTO title really opens doors. I'm sure you see this too in like just general sales. When you're reaching out, you typically have a better open or response rate if you're the CEO or founder reaching out than if you're anyone else in the company. So use that to your advantage to open doors and get people to respond. Systemize, we talked about this earlier, but use templates to do most of the heavy lifting. And I think a little bit later in the presentation, I'll actually show you kind of the process I used. But at every step of the way, there's templates that I used to reach out and move people along. So less work you have to do, and the more professional you come across, the better the process typically goes. We talked about LinkedIn, so we want to use this to our advantage. So always try to get a warm intro if possible. If this is from a referral from an existing engineer, that works the best. But if not, you can typically find someone in your network to pass along a quick intro. And then specifically when you're looking for who to reach out to, the best targets are people that you know are going to be looking for or open to receiving solicitations. So looking for companies that have had layoffs recently, that people will probably be looking for jobs, or companies that have been acquired. Those are kind of two targets that I always have, and kind of always keep an ear to the ground to figure out, all right, what companies have like laid off people recently, or what company just went, either like went public or gotten acquired, that people are kind of looking for that next step, or that they're probably open to a transition. And those have been kind of the factors that I've looked to reach out to folks. In general, I've had really good luck looking out for people who tend to be at a company for about two plus years. That tends to be like a decent lifespan for a developer at a company. So if you see someone's been at a company for around that time, those have been the folks that have had the best success at actually getting them to respond. Cool. All right. So we talked about outreach and building rapport over email. This is an actual example of the types of emails that I would send. But the biggest thing to remember is that you are actually selling them on your business, right? You're still reaching out, it's still a solicitation. So you're basically in sales mode. Your goal is to get that person interested enough to give you the time of day and kind of want to pick in and dig in a little bit deeper. I'll send this out too if you want to copy and paste this and kind of make this your own, like feel free. But this is a great example of like, hey, John, we've never met. Here's who I am. I want to get in touch because your profile caught my eye. There's some roles open that I think you would really benefit from. And here's what we do. And just get them like really excited about what you do with like a friendly open email. That's where I've seen the best response, the best success. But again, your mileage may vary. Feel free to make this your own. And then kind of the other side of that coin is actually having a process to run. So like I said, I'll send this out, but this is an example of how I've kind of stayed organized and a process that you can put together. This is just using Trello, which is free. You can also use Asana or any other type of organization tool that you want. But everything is about a funnel. It's about moving people through. And if you see, like, some of the cards on like the top of the rows are actually just outreach templates that I would just copy and paste to send to people in that row to move them along. But just the fact that you are organized enough and you can actually tell someone like, oh, hey, Yusuf, like, you completed the phone screen, we're moving you on to the next step. And the next step is, an in-person interview. We're going to get that scheduled in the next week. We'll set you apart from other folks that don't do that in general. All right. Next step is the phone screen or Zoom interview in these days. But again, on the phone screen, if you have reached out to someone, gotten them to give you the time of day, you're still in sell mode. So your goal is, one, still to sell them, but two, to determine if this candidate is strong enough to actually be brought in for an in-person interview or a wider interview with the rest of the team. Again, that goes back to the whole idea of protecting your team's time. So as much as you can do upfront that doesn't take up your team's time, that's actually building your business and building the products that you need built, the better. So that's your goal. In-person interviews take up your team's time. Make sure that you're pretty confident before you actually bring somebody in or open it up to a wider group that customer, that the candidate is actually going to be a decent hire for you. So the more you can do to kind of check the boxes and make sure that person's a good fit, the better. And then who asked, somebody asked a question about if there should be like coding challenges. So this is actually the step to include that coding challenge. So the worst question asked on a phone screen is, tell me a bit about yourself. Too general, tells you nothing. You typically already have the candidate's resume, you know their background. So don't waste time asking them to tell a bit about themselves. Instead, again, go into sell mode, make them tell you like why they are excited about your business, and use that to kind of pump them up and get them excited. The other thing that you should do is kind of do a little poking and prodding into some of their career aspirations, because that gives you a way to kind of weave and tell the story. You guys are in Techstars, so you know everything is about storytelling and crafting that arc. So the best way to get somebody to actually come and join your company is to craft the story arc in a way that it meets their needs or their career aspirations. So you figure out those things by literally asking them on the phone screen. So why they're excited about your business, and then a little bit about what their career aspirations are, which then you can kind of weave back into the conversation later. Cool. So then the general flow that I typically use on a phone screen is talk first briefly, get them excited about the company, then kind of turn it over to them and let them tell me why they're excited about the company. And then I spend most of the time actually diving into technical coding exercises and actually having them write code on keyboard. This can be done either remote pair programming. There's sites like CodeShare, and there's probably like a dozen others out there. But this is where you should spend most of your time. Essentially, what you're trying to do is you're trying to check as many boxes as you possibly can for this candidate before you start like opening them up to the rest of your team. So
you mean live, actually doing it there and then?
Totally. Yep. So literally, because I mean, it's the best way to figure out if someone's actually going to be able to do the job is giving them some like typical challenges that are going to come up, that always come up on like a day-to-day basis that they can do, like that they should be able to do in a 20, 30-minute time frame. So literally share your screen, say, hey, like I've run it, and I actually have some examples that I later on in the presentation that I'll send out, but literally have them sit down and say, hey, here's a problem that we're having. If you were, if this popped up in, on a regular day-to-day, how would you solve it? Like, let's go through and pair program this together. And when I say pair program, it's like they are doing it, and you're just kind of like watching them, kind of asking questions as you go.
If you're not technical, hopefully it was skill on your team when you're doing this. Let's say that you don't.
Yep. You can still do this, right? So even if you're not technical, it's like the examples that I have here, there are some examples and then like some solutions, but it's the good thing about programming is you give someone a problem set and like a solution set. And it's like, this thing should produce this thing, go ahead and do it. And if they can do it, it's pretty obvious. And if they don't, then it's also pretty obvious. So even if you're not technical, there's ways to kind of get around it. Yeah.
What's more than the kind of results and them getting there? It's like they have to be engaged, they can ask you the right questions. You have, like, the questions we ask in interviews, they're very basic, very basic. It's just to see you guys want to work with them, and you have problems, stuff like that. Just like that, we come basic, some basic questions.
Right.
So,
Yeah, it's more about the thought process that goes into solving a problem for sure. The other thing too is like these are not designed to be like, you know, zingers and like super hard things to do. These are typically like basic things where like the problems that are going to come up on a daily basis that, you know, can't take more than, you know, 15 minutes or something to go through and solve. So just the fact that you put it in front of them, if they can come up with some type of solution, will give you confidence that they know what they're doing. You will not believe the number of people that I've interviewed that like basic stuff that should be like very quick, not even a conversation should be had about like, oh yeah, this is easy. Like here, I know exactly what to do. I'll get started here. I've just been like crickets. Like Ken has no idea what to do. So basically what you're trying to do is trying to weed those folks out and just kind of filter through the folks that really know what they're doing and can really help you. So that's the general idea. Cool. All right. So the in-person interview, which also nowadays can be a wider group Zoom call. But basically the whole idea is by the time you get somebody here, you have enough of confidence that essentially this person could probably handle the position for which you're hiring. And now the goal is to open it up to the wider team, get buy-in from the wider team and kind of assess their abilities a little bit deeper. Like I said, if you're going to be hiring a remote team, this is going to be a remote interview, but you can open this up to wider members of your team remotely to kind of give everybody a chance to actually talk to that person. The other thing that a lot of folks don't do well is to actually use this as an opportunity to make your own team stronger and gel your own team. So when you have a systemized process and you're kind of putting each candidate through the same process, you have the ability to kind of rotate various questions and give people on your own team responsibility to assess them in a given area, which then makes your own team even stronger, right? Because essentially what you're going to do, you're going to interview this person, everybody's going to go around and kind of assess them in a given area, and then you meet afterwards and do a roundtable, and everyone literally goes around and says, okay, like Bob, you had a chance to talk to this candidate and you were doing database questions. How would you assess their knowledge of like SQL and database like Go? And you can kind of rotate things, but it gives people the sense of kind of being bought in and having like a piece of the hiring process, which actually makes your team stronger. So that's the other part in terms of like culture building, is you can use the hiring process to build a stronger culture of your existing team. So that's why I wanted to put this in here. This is the process I used. Doesn't have to be, this is not like one size fits all, but I have some examples in the appendix that I'll send out in terms of the in-person interview breakdown. But these are the types of areas that I had the team members ask for and basically assigned different roles. So somebody would ask some warm-up challenge, coding challenge questions. We had somebody would focus on just database modeling questions. We had some SQL query questions, some general Unix, Linux, like can you use a terminal? Do you know your way around a terminal questions? And then the last, which is probably the most important area, was behavioral screening. So asking about previous things that they've done just to kind of see how they behave in various scenarios. So after going through the in-person interview, doing the roundtable and kind of checking the box that this is someone that I want to move forward with, the last step that I always recommend doing is doing some reference checks. So there's two options. The first option is to ask the person themselves for at least 2 references that you can check. If they can't produce those, that might be a red flag that they have nobody that can actually vouch for them. The better option is to actually do some back channeling and reach out to people that know the candidate who has worked with the candidate before and actually see what they thought of working together. Really, the only one question I would actually say that you really need to ask, because by this point you really have determined this person can do the job and I want to hire this person. So the one question I typically ask is, what advice do you have for the person's manager to make sure that this candidate is set up for success going forward, and just kind of listen to see what they say. As an optional open-ended question, you can also ask like what it's like working with the candidates, or anything that we should know, and kind of dig in more. But I found that first question of like, what advice would you have for the person's manager to make sure this person's successful, typically yields like really insightful things that help you in the future. Okay. Word of the wise, if you're working with recruiters, which we haven't touched upon yet, this is kind of mostly if you're doing the actual hiring yourself. Working with recruiters, one, they will reverse engineer your process if you systemize it, and they'll actually start understanding what questions you're going to ask. So if you are working with a recruiter consistently, just know that probably every 2 or 3 candidates, you're probably going to have to alter what you ask, because otherwise the recruiter will do the same thing. They will do a roundtable with the candidate after they've interviewed and say, what was asked, what were your responses, and then they'll actually talk to you. And then eventually they'll feed that data to the next candidate that comes in through them to kind of give them a higher percentage of actually being hired. So anyway, just a word to the wise. You can work with recruiters. My suggestion, if you're going to be working with recruiters, is to pick 2 or 3, not more than that, and exclusively work with those recruiters and expect them, like give them a quota and expect them to actually send you candidates on a consistent basis. And if they do, great. And if they don't, move on to somebody else. Because there are so many recruiters out there, the worst thing you can do is have like, 20 recruiters out there that are all like just basically rapid fire sending you resumes, and it's kind of like, throw shit against the wall and see what sticks. That's not the environment you want, because that'll take up all your time, and it's actually very difficult to like sift through all the stuff. So the best advice I have, if you want to work with a recruiter, if you have a budget to work with a recruiter, is pick 2 or 3 and tell them that you're only picking 2 or 3 and they are one of 2 or 3 that you're working with, but that they expect constant communication and you expect them to send you candidates on a pretty consistent basis.
I intentionally got out of my way to wait recruiters just because they're salespeople. Would you like, what point would you like say to go for it? Like, kind of just instead of wasting my time doing the process, managing all this myself, is there a point when we should actually look at it?
It comes down to budget, right? So most really early stage companies don't have the budget to like pay a recruiter, depending on how much because it's typically a percentage of the starting salary. So if you have budget for it, I'd say there's no downside to working. It's just extending and increasing your top of funnel volume. So that's never a bad thing. So if you have the budget for it, seeing more candidates is not a bad thing. What you don't want to do is like work with so many that you're like the top of funnel is so filled with just all kinds of crap that you can't run a good process. That's what you want to avoid. And the only way that you can do that is by working with a small enough number of recruiters that you can give them feedback on the candidates they send you and say, listen, like you sent me this candidate, Joe, this candidate, he's not what I'm looking for, and here's why he wasn't what I'm looking for. Don't send me other folks like that. Here's what I'm looking for. And then once they start sending you candidates on a consistent basis, they'll get better and better at what types of candidates you're looking for. And if they don't, then you have a conversation. It's like, listen, like all of your candidates are terrible. Like I'm moving on and I'm going to work with somebody else. But the only way to do that is through actually working closely with a small number of firms, not like a big number of firms just throwing things at you.
We've introduced like an employee referral scheme.
Yeah.
The last few hires have come through that probably saved us maybe a recent recruiter $12,000 $13,000.
Totally.
Is that something that's scalable, do you think, and keep going?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, and that goes back to like an earlier point too, that your existing network is probably the best source of candidates. So yeah, it kind of just, it's kind of the best of both worlds, right? Because it incentivizes your own folks to promote folks that they have worked with before, that they want to work with more, because it directly affects them, right? They're not gonna recommend somebody that you go hire someone that they hate because they're gonna have to be working with them. So yeah, that's definitely scalable. You can definitely do that for sure. So behavioral interviewing. So the best prediction of future behavior is past behavior. This is probably like the thing that I have found separates good candidates from bad candidates the quickest and easiest is asking candidates about a very specific past situation to determine how they behaved, what their thought process was, and what results they were able to produce. And so I think this should be like a critical key part of hiring in general, whether it's tech hiring or not. But I'm going to give you an example in a sec. Hit the next stage. What I typically like to do is actually have a volunteer and go through what I'm talking about with behavioral interviewing. So does anybody want to volunteer for a quick 5-minute interview? Live interview. It'll be easy, I promise. All right, let's do it. Come sit up here or there, hot seat. Nice, cool. So it'll be easy, I promise. All right. So for the behavioral interviewing, like I said, the best prediction of future behavior is past behavior. So what you want to do is you really want to ask about a specific time in someone's past, and then kind of dig in and kind of pull in there. So so my question would be, so number one, thanks so much for volunteering. You're awesome. But what I want you to do is maybe think about a time in your past where you were under a tight deadline, where you had limited resources with which to work. And I want you to just kind of tell me specifically, like the scenario, like what was the situation, like what were you trying to do, how did you approach it, and then what was the ultimate outcome? And it can be anything you want. And I'm going to take some notes as you talk, so just keep talking, but I'm listening.
No problem. Yeah, so in one of my previous jobs, when I was working at GlaxoSmithKline, we did all of the tag management on our website.
Yep.
So things like Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, all the third-party tags. And this, one of the big things for a global company was around the cookie banners and cookie consent, because we dealt with a lot of European companies. So it was pretty much the most important thing was that we could not collect data from people unless we had their consent to do so.
Yep.
And so my team inherited the cookie banner. It was via a tag management solution called Telium.
Okay.
And basically the whole thing just didn't work. It was not functioning properly. It was repeatedly showing up on every single page, which was showing a poor customer experience. And so on a very quick deadline, we needed to diagnose the problem and come up with a solution.
Okay.
So
tell me a little bit about your team. Like how many people were on it? Were there different roles? What was your role?
Yeah. So I was the engineering manager / product owner.
Okay.
We had a team in total of 12 engineers, 3 of which were onshore, the rest of which were offshore in India.
Yep.
And so this one was it basically became an around the clock type of process. So we had 3 of us in the US, 1 of us in the UK, the rest of the team in India. So what we did was just get everyone together, really identify, first things first, what the problem is that we are trying to solve for.
Okay.
And then it became an exercise of literally diving into the code and going line by line to identify where specifically in the code the problem was occurring.
Yep.
We also then tapped into our resources with Telium, the vendor that we were working with. We're able to get them on the call, and kind of my role in this process was also having to quickly reprioritize and basically say that everything else that we had potential to work on, it's okay to put that on the shelf and really focus in on that, which I think is important specifically for my role in that situation, because I was not going to be the one to write the code to fix it, but need to put the team in a position where they could drop everything and feel okay about doing that.
Okay.
And then, it was, so what ended up happening.
What was the ultimate outcome?
Yeah, so we basically had to reconfigure the entire solution that had previously been built. What we found was that we had to delete the old cookie essentially. So something was broken with the old cookie. So we renamed the cookie that was dropping onto the site, implemented that new cookie across all the 80+ websites that we were supporting, did a ton of testing to make sure that it was working, outlined all of the different user journeys where, whether people were going across different pages or going from one domain to another domain to make sure that everything was working. And in the final result, we were able to turn it all around in a week's time and fix that. And it was also like a really good team building experience because we're all working a ton. Like that was the most that we had all ever worked, but it was like fun doing it. We were getting on calls. We were, trying to keep the mood light as well while doing it. And overall, I think that it was a very successful not just solving of the problem, but also that team bonding experience was pretty important, I think, going forward.
Great. Now, if knowing what you know now, how would you approach it differently or change things differently to make it more efficient or better, to have a better outcome? Like any feedback on kind of hindsight?
I think in hindsight, maybe I would have gotten the Telium people involved sooner than later. So we probably spent the first 2 or 3 days spinning our wheels internally a bit.
Yep.
When it turned out that if we would have just brought in the people that actually built the product earlier,
yep,
they were able to help us identify things that we would not have been able to ever see from our end because we didn't have kind of the inside baseball scoop. So, maybe giving the team too much time I should have identified sooner, like, okay, clearly they're not going to be able to get this. They would have gotten it by now if they could.
Yep.
So that'd be one thing to think about in the future.
Awesome. Well, thanks. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for chatting. We'll end scene here, but I appreciate it. Thanks so much for volunteering. So so really quickly, if you go to the next slide. So if you notice, what I did there is I kind of followed like a very, very specific flow to really dive into a specific situation, because typically if you're going to ask somebody a question, one of the things that is very difficult to do is to fabricate a story that didn't actually happen, especially if you keep drilling down. So if you noticed when we were chatting, I asked specifically, like, tell me about a specific situation where you were in this scenario. And then I kept drilling into, like, what was your specific role? Like, you talked about like a team. I was part of like a 12-person team. I was like, great. Like, what were the roles? What did you do? Like, what specifically were you responsible for? How did you act? Because again, basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to move people from a we scenario to like an I scenario. Because anybody can be like, like, I worked at Salesforce and we did, $1 trillion in revenue last year. It's like, great, but what did you actually do? And that's really where you're trying to get to. So if you notice, I asked about the situation, I asked about specific tasks, about the person's role, the action, what the candidate did, how they approached the task, and then ultimately what results came of it. And then if you notice, I kind of followed up even more of like, all right, well, you've done all this, like, what was your learning experience and what would you do differently? And the whole idea here is to kind of keep picking at a single thread so that you can really get down granular and figure out, okay, if this person was with me in my company and a similar situation came up, how would they think? What would they do? So that's kind of the idea there. But I typically get more information from asking questions like this than any other type of questions. So, cool. And that's it. That's all I have. That's all I have. I'll send this deck out. So in the appendix, there's a bunch of, I think, like coding examples and exercises that I've used in the past. There's behavioral interviewing stuff in there. So feel free to take that, ask questions. I'm happy to dive in. But yeah, hope it was useful. Yeah.
Might be more general hiring as well. So say issuing options, employees are going to take preference to pay higher salaries as well. So would you go? What would you not?
It's almost like it depends on your company, right? Like what your goals are. I think we were actually talking a little bit about this in the CEO roundtable, but every conversation is typically a conversation based on what's important for that candidate. So you as a business have multiple levers that you can pull, that you can use to incentivize people, right? It's typically like actual like cash salary, you've got options, you've got benefits, flexibility, like there's all kinds of things. So typically a hiring conversation goes something like, hey, we want to make you an offer. Here's what we want to offer you. Like, here's what I think you're worth. Like, let's have a conversation to figure out what we think you're worth. And then once you agree on that, then you say, okay, I'm going to use everything I can to basically compensate you that amount. And I have cash, I have equity, I have benefits, I have the flexibility that comes with being a startup, all kinds of things. Incentive programs, commission structures, milestone-based stuff. So these are all like levers that you can pull to get somebody to say yes. So it typically comes down to a conversation of like, what's most important to you? Like, where are you in your life? Like, is cash important or is equity important? Is the ability to like work remotely from anywhere you want important? Great, like we can work with that. So it typically is a case-by-case conversation, at least initially. And then once you get to a certain level, you can probably start systemizing that a little bit where it gets a little bit more rigid of like, all right, here are our typical hiring packages. You have package A, B, C, depending on whether you want more cash, less equity, more equity, less cash, somewhere in the middle. But generally, a lot of the early hiring tends to be around, here's what I can do, here's what I can use to get you where you need to be. And it's just a conversation back and forth. At least that's where I've seen the most success.
Jack, thinking this is a view conversation as well, but you check my logic in this one. It's always different levers. I think we're going to package works for companies then. And people were something about cash and equity. The candidate who's more aligned to cash and equity is less desirable. Am I oversimplifying this? Because we've talked about this before, sort of, if we bring up, equity, get them aligned.
Yep.
We bring that up and you go, okay, yeah, then you've lost the upside of that because they're not really aligned because it wasn't their idea. They don't really see that as an incentive. So they'll take it.
Yeah.
And so what we've talked about in the past, so let them bring it up. If they bring it up, they're aligned and we're on the same page. Does this make sense? Is it logical? I don't understand.
And then let them bring up the, hey, I want some equity.
Yeah, rather than saying yes to the suggestion. They say yes, we're not going to say yes to the suggestion. But if they bring it up, then we're on the same page. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, you can do it. I mean, again, there's no right or wrong answer, so it kind of just depends on what you can get people to agree to. One of the biggest things that you have as an early stage company is the equity that you can offer someone. You definitely want people to value it. So in a general sense, you're looking for people with like what I like to call like the fire in the belly, like they're joining because they like the company, they like the mission, and they really want to be bought in. And typically those types of people would would want equity because they believe in the mission, they want the company to succeed and grow. But people are also at different levels at different times in their life. So it doesn't necessarily always translate. Like someone might be really passionate about the business, but like literally need the cash because of just like where they are. So it always comes down, at least in my experience, it's always been very situation dependent. But yeah, I like the tactic, like having them bring it up. But on the other side of that coin is that's one of your biggest levers that you can use to win candidates and incentivize them to come join your company. So great if they bring it up, but if they don't, you want to use that. It's like a pretty big tool that you can have to incentivize people. So you don't want it to just like go by the wayside.
You take it a bit further. One of the reasons why we like people having share options is because there's more time to hang around.
Yeah.
I think one of the learnings that certainly that I've had is that I'm less worried now about engineers leaving the company. Anybody that has left us, it's worked out better for us.
Yeah.
But like, what's your thoughts on that? Should we focus a lot more on trying to retain them, or just do what we do, and if they stay, they stay, and if they don't, they don't be too worried about it?
Yeah, so I don't spend any time like retaining employees, right? Like people like should be engaged and enjoy the work that they're doing. And if they're not, then you kind of don't want them there because they're a detractor. So like one thing I don't think you have to spend time on is like incentivizing people to stay. If you have to incentivize people to stay, you probably have like hired the wrong people. Just by providing like engaging work and having hiring people that are just in general excited about the business will keep them there. And there's the things that are going to keep them there through kind of like the tougher times that you're definitely going to go through. So if you're finding that you have to spend a lot of time incentivizing people to like, please don't leave, that might be like a red flag that you may not have the right person.